At the same time Suleiman was conquering the known world, a daring group of explorers was setting off into the unknown. One of the greatest of these seagoers was this man, Vasco da Gama. He was sent to sea by the King of Portugal. His mission, to find a route to the riches of Asia. Da Gama headed east, sailing around Africa's treacherous Cape of Good Hope. Da Gama, who traveled 3 times the distance of Columbus's first voyage, blazed the first practical ocean trail from west to east, to this day linking 2 great cultures.
I crown thee, Elizabeth, Queen of England, Ireland, and France. God save your majesty.
She was the most powerful woman Europe had ever seen. Elizabeth I, Queen of England, number 80 on our list. She was remarkably modern, a quick-witted politician, and one of the first great spin doctors.
She was someone who was brilliant at propaganda. She went on these progresses through England. She would come and talk to ordinary people. She was dazzling. She was a great speaker. So she was a wonderful image maker.
Her subjects adored her. A striking figure and a hands-on leader, she became one of the first cult personalities in the Western world. Elizabeth reigned for 45 years, and in that time, she pushed her nation to conquer half the world. The sun would not set on her British Empire for the next 5 centuries. She opened new worlds. She destroyed old worlds. Number 78, Queen Isabella I, didn't just bankroll Christopher Columbus, she did much more, and not always for the better.
Isabella did help shape modern Spain as we know it. She married Ferdinand of Aragon, and between them, they created a more effective, a more coherent kingdom than had ever existed before.
But Isabella also cast a shadow over Europe, for she set in motion the Spanish Inquisition. Thousands of Jews and Muslims were killed, tortured, and forced to flee. On foreign shores, Isabella's funding would lead to the opening of the New World, a breakthrough in exploration and later exploitation, as Spanish conquistadors eventually conquered nearly all of Central and South America. In 1628, Dr. William Harvey wrote a short pamphlet describing the human body's circulatory system. Many believe it's the most important medical text ever written. Until Harvey, doctors believed blood was manufactured by the liver, moving back and forth through the body like the tides of an ocean.
The reason people wear wedding rings on this finger is it was thought in the old days that there was a special vein that went all the way from there right directed to the heart. Harvey made it clear that all the veins go back to the heart, not just that one from the finger.
William Harvey discovered that blood constantly circulates through the body, pumped by the heart. His explanation of the heart and circulatory system was revolutionary, the bedrock on which modern physiology, the study of how our body functions, is built. He set sail in 1519 looking for trade routes. What he found was a whole new world. This man, Portugal's Ferdinand Magellan. He led his fleet down the east coast of South America and discovered a passageway to the Pacific Ocean, the strait that still bears his name. Magellan died before his fleet struggled back to Spain, but his expedition achieved something unprecedented, the first journey around the Earth.
What it did is it really, I think, gave us a global context of our planet.
And Magellan's trip did one more very important thing. It proved that the world is round. Ferdinand Magellan's dreams may have been fueled by reading the exploits of this man, the Venetian merchant Marco Polo. Perhaps the most famous travel writer, Polo journeyed to Mongol China in 1271 and stayed nearly 20 years. His book, The Travels of Marco Polo, was filled with fantastic stories, and the first maps of Asia ever seen in the West. Polo's adventures ignited European interest in the Orient and inspired generations of explorers to come. Niccolo Machiavelli, number 46. This author and diplomat wrote the book that's still the definitive study of politics nearly 500 years later. Machiavelli told aspiring rulers that to stay on the throne, they must be prepared to use any means necessary.
That notion of power as a kind of independent end in itself, whether a good or a bad thing, that is Machiavelli's contribution to the modern world. The fact that Machiavelli talks about how to be amoral in pursuing power means that whenever we don't like someone, we call them Machiavelli.
Sir Francis Bacon, number 38, was a philosopher, statesman, and pioneer of modern science, the father of the scientific method.
The vision that Bacon comes up with, that we are, in fact, capable of understanding the world, of knowing it better, and that science is the way of doing it, is a very important vision.
His scientific method is at the core of all modern research. To understand the way things work, Bacon said, you have to go out and observe the world, gather data, experiment. Ironically, science also proved his undoing. Testing to see if cold could preserve food, Bacon stuffed a raw chicken with snow. The experiment was a success, but Bacon himself caught a chill and died. I think, therefore I am. Number 32, René Descartes, father of modern philosophy. But it's not just philosophy that earned him a place on our list.
I think Descartes makes the top 100 easily. His contributions to mathematics are incalculable.
X squared plus y squared equals z squared. That's Descartes. He was the first to describe a curve in space as a formula. It's called analytical geometry, and it's essential to every branch of science. He then used the scientific method to build a framework for philosophy.
And what he says is that in the end, all I know is that I'm thinking. Whatever else may be true or not true, I, Descartes, am thinking. Since I'm thinking, therefore I exist. And from that very, very tiny admission, Descartes builds an entire philosophy.
Descartes taught us to doubt the word of authority, to believe only what we can perceive for ourselves. He showed us that the entire universe is rational, governed by physical laws. And that is why every scientist, every thinker today can be called a descendant of Descartes. He was always complaining. Painting and sculpture have been my ruin, he wrote. I would have been better off making matches. But few artists have created more memorable images than Michelangelo, divine light of the Renaissance.
Artists influence our lives because of a burning image. And you don't have to even know the artist, but they're images that burn into our consciousness.
Michelangelo was already creating images of transcendent beauty at a very young age. His Pietà was completed when he was only 25. And he was only 29 when he transformed the discarded hunk of marble into his most famous sculpture.
The David is this vulnerable young boy looking at his fate and the fate of his people. It was carved out of a totally flawed piece of Carrara marble that had been brought down to Florence at great expense. He just went, he attacked it and delivered. He sculpted out the flaw and delivered this figure, which is the patron saint of Florence.
Michelangelo agonized over his works and often failed to complete them. He would spend more than 4 years on his back, meticulously painting the ceiling of Rome's Sistine Chapel. He argued constantly with his benefactors over his artistic vision. In a scene from the film The Agony and the Ecstasy, Charlton Heston, as Michelangelo, clashed with Pope Julius II over his depiction of the human body.
I will paint man as God made him, in the glory of his nakedness.
Michelangelo persisted, and when he finally finished, it was like the hand of God reaching across the centuries. Today, that celestial spark still touches us.
I'm not an art historian or even anyone qualified to judge art, but I can tell you that walking around in St. Peter's Basilica and looking at the Pietà was one of the most moving experiences I've ever had, because Michelangelo managed to pull humanity out of cold marble. It's so hard to imagine that anyone has such a gift to create life from cold stone.
Michelangelo lived to be 89. His last years were spent designing St. Peter's Church. Its distinctive dome would be widely copied around the world. He died with the work unfinished, perfectionist to the end. He is the original Renaissance man, Leonardo da Vinci, painter, inventor, and scientist extraordinaire. Leonardo was one of the most prolific geniuses of all time, yet some of our experts think his achievements are overrated.
Leonardo da Vinci, whom you have in your list, is a wonderful mind, a wonderful figure, someone who we all admire, but I don't think that he really helped change the world.
I mean, I just think that having two Renaissance is kind of amusing, and no medieval, no Greek artists, for Pete's sake. Get some sleep. Go on a vacation.
Still, when all the votes were tallied, Leonardo da Vinci earned a place near the top of our Millennium countdown. For you could say he invented the modern idea of the artist as visionary. Leonardo was the illegitimate son of a peasant girl and a Florentine notary. But what he lacked in paternity, he made up for in curiosity. Although we think of him as a painter, there are surprisingly few finished paintings by Leonardo. Yet his works, including the extraordinary Last Supper and the Mona Lisa, would have a profound influence down through the ages.
The Mona Lisa has a significance in history which may outweigh some of its merits as art. It is painted beautifully. I mean, it's an extraordinary picture. But there's no question that the Mona Lisa, for many people, represents art with a capital A.
But Da Vinci's greatest contribution may have nothing to do with art, for as a scientist, he towered over his contemporaries. He was ahead of his time in engineering, anatomy, hydraulics, and aerodynamics, to name but a few. He had a keen eye for the way things work, the circulation of the blood, the effect of the moon on tides. He designed literally thousands of things, from submarines to airplanes. Most were never built in his time.
Tell your experts to get less tired.
But they still inspire us today.
A great deal of what we have of Leonardo is ideas, sketches, notebooks, unbelievably clear insights and observations of nature, aerodynamics, hydrodynamics. He invented the first helicopter on paper but didn't make it. He sort of rethought the world.
Centuries would pass before his ideas took wing, and it would take even longer for us to understand all the concepts in his notebooks. Today, Leonardo stands as an icon, a visionary peering across the years. Yet, ironically, this man so famous for the precision of his observation was himself little observed, little known. Like his famous painting, he remains an enigma to this day.
There stands Leonardo as the sort of quintessential definition of the genius, the man who could do everything and about whom there is a kind of mystery that is insolvable.
Welcome back to the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, England. Well, we have made it to the final 10, the 10 people who have had the greatest impact on the last 1,000 years. In a way, they're all explorers, for each set their sights on a distant frontier. But when it comes to their actual professions, it may not surprise you that half of them are scientists. For if the past millennium is marked by anything, it is the fact that scientific discovery is the single greatest agent of change on the planet. One man who transformed the way we think about ourselves and the planet we live on is number 10 on our list, Italian astronomer and physicist Galileo Galilei. Galileo was a confident, even arrogant man with a flair for the dramatic. And what he discovered was dramatic: the science of modern astronomy. Galileo took the newly fashioned telescope, reinvented it, and pointed it toward the sky.
And he saw things that no one before him had seen. The moon was thought to be a perfectly spherical orb in the sky, divinely made. He found blemishes on it. These discoveries were so profound that the establishment presupposed that Galileo's telescope was some kind of sorcery that he had cooked up just to undermine the authority of the church.
Galileo shattered the notion that the Earth was the center of the universe. Instead, he said, planets circle the sun. At the time, it was a shocking theory, for everyone believed in an Earth-centered galaxy. Not only that, it was fundamental to church doctrine.
If God said we're special and he created us specially, why would he put us on any other part of the universe except its center? Once you shake that notion, you've challenged something very fundamental.
Galileo was hauled before the Inquisition in Rome and charged with heresy. Old and ill, he nonetheless made a stirring defense for the truth.
People ask, well, isn't what you say about the universe, doesn't it conflict with the Bible? And he said, the Bible tells you how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go.
But the church was not amused, and Galileo was forced to repudiate his claims. He spent the last 9 years of his life under house arrest, the price he paid for being ahead of his time. Today, Galileo stands as a symbol for freedom of thought and an emblem of the battle against authority, a battle he eventually won. For the Vatican finally acknowledged that it had wronged the Italian astronomer, but not until 1992. Galileo was a man who revolutionized our understanding of the solar system in his spare time. Nicholas Copernicus was never a professional astronomer. He worked most of his later in his native Poland. But what he accomplished in his off hours laid the foundation for everything we know about the galaxy.
Copernicus was the first scientist to actually come up with a mind-blowing idea that then took hold and forced the world to rethink our position in the universe.
Copernicus lived a century before Galileo, so he had no telescope to work with. Using only the naked eye and crude instruments, he dreamed up the theory that Galileo would one day prove. Copernicus theorized that the Earth and all the planets move, that our world rotates on its axis every 24 hours to make a day, that it completes an orbit around the sun in a year. It was at the time a ridiculous notion that just turned out to be right.
It gives us contemporary astronomy. It takes us from an Earth-centered system to a planetary system. And boy, that's a leap.
A leap both physical and metaphysical.
If you believe you're the center of the universe, it's a metaphor for all sorts of godlike presuppositions about ourselves. Then the question is, if you're not the center of the universe, what are you? Who are you, where are you located, and what is the universe? And those are the questions we've been dealing with ever since.
Copernicus realized the radical and explosive nature of his theories, and he kept them to himself for almost 30 years. Colleagues finally persuaded him to publish. Legend has it, the first copy was presented to him on his deathbed.
Very few people, other than other mathematicians and a number of astronomers, are even aware of what he's done or even terribly interested. It's not really till Galileo comes along that the idea becomes the heart of an entirely new system and then really begins to take hold.
The complex vision of the universe theorized by Copernicus would be fully accepted for another 200 years. But it would eventually take man to the moon and beyond, and inspire the generations of scientists who followed.
Christopher Columbus deserves to be on the list because he opened up the Americas and created the world that we know. He's controversial because of the introduction of slavery into the Americas, the decimation of the Native American populations can be traced to Columbus.
Christopher Columbus, Italian navigator, discoverer of the New World. Few people on our list are quite so controversial. For his is a story of courage and a series of blunders. Columbus believed the world was almost all land. He headed the wrong way, miscalculated by 8,000 miles, and ended up in the wrong location. And yet his magnificent discovery would transform our planet. By the mid-15th century, when the Ottoman Empire closed off access to the riches of Asia, Columbus speculated that the Orient could be reached by sailing not east at all, but west.
He's a mystic, you know. He's sort of half genius, half crackpot. I mean, he believes, of course, he's finding the East, not the West. He's finding the Indies.
At the time, most mariners believed the Earth was much smaller than it actually is. Yet they were certain that Columbus's plan would end in disaster. After 6 years, Columbus finally persuaded Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to finance his journey. Columbus set off in 1492 on the first of 4 voyages west. He would sight virtually every island of the Caribbean, travel along Central America, and be credited as the first Westerner to lay eyes on the South American continent. He was also the advance guard for the creation of a mighty Spanish empire that would dominate the New World for more than a century.
Columbus spread the culture of Europe to the Americas. He didn't discover America, but part of the theme of this millennium is the growing influence of European culture around the world, and Columbus is one of the most important players in that process.
America was extraordinarily important to Europe because it created a sense of openness, of growth, of opportunity, which led to an extraordinary explosion of energy. And as Europeans conquered larger and larger areas, it led to a sense of confidence, which became one of the hallmarks of European civilization.
While Europeans benefited from the opening of the New World, those who lived there paid a terrible price. Within 4 years of Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean, his men had killed or enslaved 1/3 of the native Taíno Indians on the island of Hispaniola. Columbus's Spanish patrons were delighted with the new lands he conquered, but uneasy with the many reports of brutality against the natives.
When he gets to the New World, Spanish crown is rather upset about the way he behaves. So as an angel of good and an angel of horror, it's all him.
In the century of Spanish dominion after Columbus, millions of New World natives would be slaughtered or die of disease brought by their conquerors, and the slave trade would usher in centuries of misery and humiliation. Yet, if this millennium is marked by the rise of European civilization, then we must credit Columbus as its catalyst. Misguided, perhaps, but brave nevertheless, carrying the flag into the unknown.
This too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. Or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter. Oh, God.
I would put Shakespeare very high on the list because the soul of mankind matters as much as the science of the universe. And Shakespeare held the soul of mankind in his hands.
He is the world's most famous writer, and yet we know very little about him. William Shakespeare, number 5, would have appreciated that few artists had such a subtle grasp of the human heart and such a rich command of the tales he wove.
One is tempted to say that Shakespeare was the greatest writer who ever lived or ever could live, because it's almost unimaginable that the wits of the genius could ever be matched again. He's an extraordinary constructor of plots, extraordinary psychologist, a great myth maker, But the language, above all, I suppose, is what establishes him as just the leading writer of the world, to me.
He came to London from the English countryside, and by 1592 he was crafting a successful career as an actor, author, and poet. His performances took him from the stage of the Globe Theatre to the court of Queen Elizabeth. He captivated audiences, although at the time he was considered an untutored genius, a little rough around the edges. A century later, the full measure of his achievement would be acknowledged. For in some 154 sonnets and 38 plays, through Othello and Lear and Richard III, Shakespeare created a timeless dramatic mirror of the way we live.
When we see a young man incapable of making a decision, an important decision, we think Hamlet. When we see an old man who is turned upon by his children and feels that his life has been worthless, we think of Lear. When we think of lovers, we think of Romeo and Juliet, and so on and so on and so on. You cannot name another writer who has created the models for the way we think as Shakespeare.
Today, the works of Shakespeare are performed more than any other playwright. His plays are transformed into musicals, operas, ballets, and of course, movies, for they are the inspiration we return to again and again.
I suppose if someone could name me a film that didn't draw directly from Shakespeare, I would think that that person was the next William Shakespeare. Because I think every plot, every story that anyone tells pretty much falls in step with the plots that Shakespeare invented. All of us, you know, have William Shakespeare to thank.
Shakespeare's works invite imitation. They almost beg for it.
Two Gentlemen of Malibu. Have you ever heard that one? That's, oh, yet this simple wave will break slowly, yet not knowing why. Oh, boogie on, this not knowing this thing I do call thee friend, wax my board and not know who thee are. Oh, gentle Richard, would that I had not known why. I don't care. It'd be great to think if Shakespeare could write Richard IV, you know. I'm not willing, trapped before my time, sent undine and not knowing. Ill laughed, and they do laugh at my shadow. I'm not a crook, yet knowing this, I will splice until dawn and walk towards the copter unknown.
The richness of Shakespeare's inspiration, the complexity of his works, has led some people to ask, how could the son of a glove maker who never traveled beyond England be the author of such exquisite words? Some claim that Shakespeare was a front for a man of more noble birth who wished to be anonymous. One of the suspects is our number 38, Sir Francis Bacon.
Well, they also think it's not just Francis Bacon. It's like, or the Earl of Oxford, you know. There's a huge debate about that. I mean, here's the deal. You basically think of, you know, at that time, look in the plays. There's incredible references in Latin, Greek, travel. I mean, the scope is global. And yet, you know, it's, if you think of its will, just wandering around, knocking on doors in Stratford going, is this to be or not to be?
But in the end, perhaps it really doesn't matter who wrote Shakespeare's words, for they are powerful and they endure.
Those plays, what are they, 500 years old now, continue to work, and they continue to work visually, theatrically, and personally. You know, Hamlet, we know exactly who that is. And Lear, and also that range of what it is to be young and narcissistic and self-indulgent and what it is to be old and knowing it's over, and to be able to touch the heart that deeply.
Will Shakespeare live on forever? Yes, Shakespeare, you know, will certainly live beyond, I think, most of the people on this list.
His father wanted him to be a lawyer and was appalled when he became a priest. But this simple German friar would transform the way we look at faith, and by extension, society itself. Martin Luther.
The leader of the Protestant Reformation. I mean, he changed the world. I just assumed that he would, if not be number one, certainly in the top 5.
Martin Luther's story begins with a crisis of faith. He was sickened by the corruption and greed of his fellow priests, and he was overwhelmed by guilt for his own sinfulness. He prayed and fasted for days on end. Finally, he had a revelation. Only by faith can man reach salvation, he decided. Not through donations to the church, not through a priest at all. just through devotion to God and his mercy.
The church was saying, you need the priest, you need ceremonies, you need to use the church in order to attain salvation. Luther said, no, we cannot accept religious belief from others. Unless you have faith, unless you feel the faith within you, you cannot be saved.
With Luther, it's a gigantic shift of authority from other people to the individual. You're not given the keys to salvation. You find them for yourself.
Luther even began to translate the Bible from Latin into German so that all could read it.
Changing religious practice from an obscure ancient dead language, Latin, to the vernacular, to your own living language, English, German, French, Dutch. It's a kind of repossession. I mean, it really lets you own your belief.
The conflict between Martin Luther and the church came to a head in 1517 when Luther decided to take a stand. He attacked the Catholic hierarchy in a diatribe called the 95 Theses. Legend has him hammering the document to the front door of the local church. Luther was dragged before an assembly in the German city of Worms. When he refused to recant, he was declared a heretic and excommunicated. Soon after, Luther gathered his supporters together and established the first Protestant congregation, breaking off in protest against the Catholic Church.
The central idea that there is no longer a homogeneous Western Christianity, that is an immensely important idea, a liberating idea. It's an idea that leads people to believe they can fashion their religion in their own way. And the proliferation of sects and individual oddballs and strange ideas in the years following Luther's revolution is quite extraordinary.
Extraordinary, yes, but explosive as well. Although the Reformation broadened people's individual and intellectual freedoms, it also led directly to the 30 Years' War, one of the bloodiest in Europe's history. But despite the carnage that ensued from the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther holds his position on our Millennium Countdown because he eloquently defined man's ability to relate directly to God.
I think Luther's statement at the Diet of Worms, "Here I stand, God rest my soul, I can do no other," is in many ways the core statement of conscience that underlies all modern democracy.
Number 2 on our list would have been unhappy to be second to anybody. He was an eccentric, insecure man who was abandoned as a child. He once threatened to kill his stepfather and burn his house down. In later years, he would grow violent defending his work and would even suffer a nervous breakdown. Yet looking back, no one can dispute the importance of this man, Sir Isaac Newton, founder of modern science, master of mathematics and physics.
I think Newton is the greatest scientist of the millennium, up there with Galileo, Darwin, and Einstein. But Newton probably had the most influence. He was the person who put together mathematics, physics, and the universe and helped us see what science can do.
Life on Earth was not the same after Newton compared with before. If he didn't exist, it would have been another 100 years before someone would have done what he contributed.
Isaac Newton was a farm boy from the rural English town of Woolsthorpe, whose innate intelligence and curiosity were recognized early on. He studied at Cambridge, but when the bubonic plague struck England in the 1660s and cities were evacuated, Newton returned home, and that's where it all began.
He left Cambridge and went to live in the countryside, where he devoted himself to meditation and mathematical experiments. And it was during this that he did his monumental work on the laws of motion.
Sitting in an orchard, Newton saw an apple plummet from its tree and wondered why it fell straight down toward the center of the earth. From that simple observation, he extrapolated the laws that govern the Earth's gravity, the orbits of the planets, the positions of the stars.
He was in his teens and just barely in his 20s, where he then sort of single-handedly deduces the laws of gravity and laws of optics and laws of motion. That is sheer brilliance.
He devised a complex new branch of mathematics almost as an afterthought. We now know it as calculus. Almost every problem of higher engineering or physics is built upon the foundation of Newton's calculus. And it's indispensable for plotting the movements of planets and the paths of spacecraft.
You guys are up there, and who's driving? That's a good question. I think Isaac Newton's doing most of the driving right now.
We couldn't have gotten to the moon without Sir Isaac Newton. We wouldn't have gotten there. Here is a fellow that hundreds and hundreds of years ago came up with these laws of physics that have endured for so long. I mean, he's the guy that taught us what makes the world go round.
The impact of his work is staggering. Just look at the other names on our list who owe him a debt. If it hadn't been for Newton, the Wright brothers would never have gotten off the ground. Henry Ford's Model T would be up on blocks. Edison would still be sitting in the dark, and Bill Gates would be building a better abacus. Newton didn't start the scientific revolution, but he took the discoveries of those who came before him, like Copernicus, Galileo, and Descartes, and increased their significance many-fold.
Newton has a wonderful phrase. He says, they may be giants and we may be pygmies, but we stand on the shoulders of giants and we can see further. Newton finally made it clear that science is here to stay, that you can't attack science anymore as mistaken or wrong-headed or evil or simply unnecessary. He made science central to Western thought.
The scientific age that Newton ushered in is so much a part of our lives today, we often take it for granted. But it was his groundbreaking theories of light and motion, mechanics and gravity that would eventually make science accessible to everyone. Finally, we could comprehend our planet and take our newfound understanding to the edges of the universe. Scientists and kings, artists and even madmen. We've met them all on our list. Now we reach the top, the #1 choice of our panel, the person they picked as the most influential of the past 1,000 years. As always, our experts did not exactly speak with one voice.
I thought about how you define influence. Who did something that was both helpful and essential? And that's how I came up with Copernicus.
There's no doubt in my mind, and no question, that Isaac Newton not only belongs in the top 10, but if I had a vote in it, he'd be #1.
Newton and Copernicus were bona fide geniuses, but our panel's #1 person of the millennium was a hard-working German tradesman born 600 years ago. He wasn't a brilliant philosopher or theorist. He wasn't even a very good businessman. He was persistent and ingenious, laboring for years to perfect one invention. The invention was the printing press. The man, Johann Gutenberg.
Gutenberg would be surprised, I think, to be #1 because he was not a genius. Newton knew he was a genius. Copernicus knew he was changing the whole way we looked at the world. Gutenberg was sort of a tinkerer, a shopkeeper, somebody who puts together something, and yet the inventing of the printing press, even if it isn't the great genius who does it, transforms our society perhaps as much as the theory of gravity or the theory of calculus.
When Gutenberg printed 200 copies of the Holy Bible in 1455, it marked a turning point in our civilization.
Before Gutenberg, if you wanted news, it almost always was oral. The only communication, if you lived in some village somewhere in Europe, the only time you ever heard anything about the outside world was not because a letter or a book arrived. It was because someone arrived. Someone came and brought news.
Printing was not a new idea. The Chinese and Koreans had used wood and metal type to print, but the process was slow and unwieldy. In the West, most books were hand-copied by monks, but a single volume might take months to produce. Gutenberg's breakthrough came when he combined earlier printing techniques with a new design for movable metal type. Then he put it all together with a press similar to one used to make olive oil. With this, printing history was made. Gutenberg would continue in the printing trade until his death, but he was always short of money. In fact, when his splendid Bible appeared, all the profits went to his creditors. Yet, what Gutenberg wrought was astonishing. Within 50 years, 20 million books had been printed in Europe. In another 100 years, that number increased tenfold.
We evolved from being a society that was all city-states and villages that didn't communicate to being a global society in which all information could be communicated. That starts with the printing press.
Gutenberg's breakthrough helped Renaissance thought to flower and spread, and Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation to attract new followers. Then came the scientific discoveries of Descartes, Galileo, and Newton, and of course, the Industrial Revolution. News of technological breakthroughs, innovations in politics and the arts, all spread swiftly through newspapers, pamphlets, and journals. Gutenberg's printing press unleashed the power of ideas, and in many ways, his information revolution is only just beginning.
Gutenberg allowed us to transmit information so much more easily and freely. That continues through the current day, through the invention of the beginning of the century of radio, then of television, then of the internet and email. It begins with Gutenberg, and it's a 500-year process.
Over the past 5 centuries, that information has altered the face of history. Power left the hands of the elite. A literate middle class was born. And all around the world, authoritarian states have found it more and more difficult to keep their citizens in the dark.
Governments may say, don't print this in the newspaper, don't pass this information around, but it's all being faxed around. You can't hide that much from the people anymore.
The effect of the press on our lives is essential. We can't, as a democracy, live without it. It infuriates us. There's lots of bad press. But I've seen the opposite. I've lived in the Soviet Union in the bad old days. I've seen the effect of a non-press on a people. And if that's the option, then I think every American would say, count me out.
I think what the printing press does is it makes democracy more inevitable. Because when people have ideas, when people have information, people will have power. That's what the French Revolution is about, the American Revolution is about. And what happens in the years from Gutenberg's inventing of the printing press to today is the gradual growth of democracy, freedom, liberty, and personal empowerment. You don't have that if you don't have the printing press.
So much of what defines our millennium would never have happened without Gutenberg's printing press and its astonishing ability to get the word out.
If we had no Gutenberg, we wouldn't have had Shakespeare. If we'd had no Gutenberg, we wouldn't have had Karl Marx. If we'd had no Gutenberg, we wouldn't have had Albert Einstein.
Virtually every person on our millennium list of 100 owes a debt to Johann Gutenberg. Consider those who wrote and published their theories and ideas, like Darwin and his Origin of Species, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, even Hitler's Mein Kampf. Were it not for Gutenberg, they might not have been inspired to greatness or infamy by reading the works of others, and their own thoughts and ideas would not have survived beyond their own lifetime to influence future generations. Artists like Michelangelo or Picasso, Beethoven or the Beatles, scientists like Marie Curie, Alexander Fleming, or Sigmund Freud. Their creations and discoveries have been reproduced on the printed page, broadcast on radio and television, and are now available to whole new audiences via the internet. Thanks again to the printer from Mainz, Germany. It's hard to imagine who may be the #1 person of the next millennium, but there's no doubt they too will owe a great debt to Johann Gutenberg.
Without Gutenberg, I would say that we wouldn't be entering the next millennium. We would now be contemplating what it would be like to reach the 1600s. We would be 500 years behind our time.